Hello, everyone. This is Learn to Listen with Mariah. Today, we are joined by Monica, who is a fellow senior at Notre Dame, and she's also from Indiana. She will graduate this year with her bachelor's in neuroscience and behavior with a minor in compassionate care and medicine. She lives in Ryan Hall, where she's a senior fellow. And for those of you who don't go to Notre Dame, that's a big thing, a big identifier for us students and alum, just almost kind of like Greek life is how you can think of it. And while at Notre Dame, Monica has been on the yearbook committee, served on the neuroscience leadership committee and social media liaison. She's also a member of Notre Dame's Access Able student group, which is a group joined together in advocating for students with disabilities. And with all that time left over, she has also been a tutor, TA, and lab grader. So welcome, Monica. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
I know. I love, you're the first student we've had on here, and I was so excited that you expressed interest and also wanting to do this. Just one, because I think it's so awesome how we met. You interviewing me for the yearbook, right? Like just
Yeah.
like
No, I tell people that all the time. I'm like, I never joined yearbook expecting to like make friends off of my interviews, and for the most part, it's pretty much one and done. But yeah,
Mhm.
I was so happy that I actually made a friend through my interviews, and
I
that's
know.
really cool.
I think it was sophomore year, right? Because it was right after I did that performance in Legends, I think.
Yeah, it was for the summer student union board.
Mhm.
They did their first ever student concert as opposed to inviting someone, and you had done that, and that's what I interviewed you for. And I think our friendship happened because we ended up being in Dr. Radvansky's
Yeah.
learning and memory class, and
Mhm.
just a familiar face kind of thing that turned into a friendship, which was great.
Yeah. I know. I remember like always just being like, what's going on? Like, do you know what this term means? Because it was like a fast moving class. And
It was.
I think it was my first psychology course actually that I took at Notre Dame, like out of intro
Yeah.
psych. So it was like very in depth. And I remember just like having someone in the class who was also like being like, how are you studying for this? How are you like, do you get what this term means? Like all the little nuances that
Right. I always felt bad because I asked you for notes so many times. I'm like, oh, she's gonna kill me. I just there comes a point in every school year where I just like drop drop off, and like it's hard to get back on the train once you fall off of
for
it.
sure.
It's just
No, I never was. I was always like, oh my gosh, someone needs my, like, it kept me honest because I was like, oh, I'm taking notes. Like, I need to
honestly,
actually
I
understand.
I loved your notes because like we had a very similar, like when you get someone's notes and like they may not have a similar note taking style to you, or it wouldn't have been the same way you took notes, so your brain doesn't really process them as well. Well, I noticed that like your notes were very similar to like how
Really?
I take notes. So I was like, yes.
Oh my gosh, how have we never gone over this until now, honestly? That's so funny. I never knew that. I'm curious too, as I was thinking about it, what kind of got you into neuroscience? Like, why did you want to study it?
Yeah, so actually my neuro story is a bit interesting. So I came in to Notre Dame as a biochemistry major, and I like the biochemistry major. It's a great program if you're into that. I have nothing bad to say about it. It was just I was looking at my course trajectory, and it was very, very chem heavy. And I realized that that's not really what I was into as I was going through my classes. And when I had taken intro psych as an elective to fulfill uh, the social science requirement, I
Right.
think.
Mhm.
And I was really into it. And I realized that that I wanted more psych, but I didn't want to fill up my very limited elective space in biochem with it. So I realized that I would probably be much happier in a major that was slightly more biocentric and uh, much more easily allowed me to take psych courses. So I kind of took a leap of faith by getting into neuro, although I didn't really know much about neuroscience. And then, so I switched in as a sophomore, I believe, because luckily as a freshman, biochem and neuro are basically identical. And
Uh-huh.
when I took that Dr. Boyd's Intro to Neuroscience class, I just fell in love with it. I was like, I could sit here and listen to her talk all day,
Right? Yeah.
every day. and I was hooked, and I knew that I could study this. And it was actually a really big moment for me because, like, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this. I was like, I like science, and I chose biochem. I'm like, biology and chemistry, that's science. And it was just a very general interest. So I was really happy that when I discovered neuro, that my interest in science finally had like a concrete direction instead of just this general interest. So that's how I got into it.
Yeah, isn't it kind of funny? I've had a similar experience where I was just like pre-med, and I was like, oh, like I did kind of always love just like learning about psych and human interaction and everything. And then I forget even how or who I was like speaking with. It might have been a teammate, but they're like, oh, you should look into doing a psych elective or like sociology minor or something like that. And then they were like, or a neuro major. And it's pretty similar to the track you've been on. And I remember taking Dr. Boyd's class, and I had the same exact thought process. I was like, oh my gosh, like it just kind of clicked. And I think about it a lot. And another podcast that I love, Brene Brown's podcast, she was just talking about like a sliding door moment. It was like one of those moments when you're faced with a decision and you went one way, and like thinking about still being just pre-med, and not even having like those neuro electives or anything, I think it would have been like a very different path for me. I honestly don't think I'd have discovered that like want to understand others, and probably wouldn't even be here sitting with you on this podcast if I'm honest.
And I think like in talking to a lot of other people too, very similar kind of aha moment of, especially, I don't want to say like the hardcore neuro majors, but the people who get really externally involved are just obsessed with this major and this program. And I think that's what makes neuro really special as a program, honestly, because, you'll get, in other programs, I think you'll get people who enjoy their major, like their major, but a lot of the neuroscience majors I know are just hardcore. Love my major, want to take this as far as it can go, and are just extraordinarily passionate and happy to be here. And yeah, so I love the community too, because there's not a lot of people who are lukewarm or neutral to the neuroscience major. Most people are really excited. So.
Yeah, there's definitely something that draws everyone together to unify. And I'm curious because I've definitely felt like some pressures just with having to be like super successful as a student, both in, like the collegiate world, the Notre Dame world, and the science, College of Science. I think there's a lot of pressure to be like, oh, you're going to med school, going to grad school, junior year, you're studying for MCAT. And we were just discussing this before, of just like having such a laid out plan. And it was speaking with our advisor, Dr. Michaels, she was saying, she's like, and this was some of the best advice I ever got, was, take a moment and think to yourself, like, are you just following this path because it's what you think you should do, or, what you feel like you should do, or do you actually want to do it? And, of course, that's where I decided that I didn't want to go to med school. And, I think we both, like, we've talked about this before, kind of like how you think that there's one path, but there's actually so many things that you can do in science and within neuro.
So I think one of the questions like you gave me as a sample was like, who's one of my role models? And hands down, all the way, is our advisor, Dr. Nancy Michael. You should try to get her on this podcast because she would just be a fount of wisdom.
It's actually in motion.
But she is just, in terms of like bringing me back down to earth, she is the most incredible human being, because she was the one, like, I was feeling really, to kind of bring this all full circle, my freshman and sophomore years are really difficult for me because I was just, navigating like how to be a college student, and we'll get into this later, but also how to be a college student with a disability. And biochem starts you baseline in 19 credits. You're freshman.
Yeah.
And luckily, I was in slightly less than that because of AP credit, but it was still, very hardcore classes, majors chemistry. And I'm not saying it's easier or harder than anybody else, so it's just a lot. And, I was navigating all that, and I had a lot of, like, my first exam ever of college was Calculus 1, and I didn't know at the time, but the calculus biochem puts you in is the calculus for engineers.
I've
So
heard nightmares about
had already taken some level of calculus in high school, whereas I ended in pre-calc. In the first exam I ever took in college, I got an F on, just like 59% F. I think I like cried on my bed for like an hour afterward. And I was just in like a really rough spot. Like I wasn't getting the grades I was hoping to get. And I just felt like an imposter. Like, why am I here? Like, do I even deserve to be here? Is it not going to get any better than this? Is it going to be this awful the whole time? And sophomore year got a little better, but still very much in that place of like, oh my God, what am I doing? And it wasn't, and I like Orgo really broke me because it was just bad. And I was talking to Dr. Michael, and she's like, Monica, so I just made the decision to drop majors Orgo 2 and retake it. And there's nothing wrong at all with dropping and retaking a class. But like for me, I had never even had to think of doing something like that before. And Dr. Michael just sat and looked at me, and she was like, Monica, I think when you get past the mental block that is Orgo, because of even all the negative cognitive associations you have with it, that things will get a lot better for you. And I don't know if it was like, because she said it gave me, more confidence.
Yeah.
Sure enough, that's how it turned out. And it's been great ever since sophomore year ended. I've been a lot stronger academically, and I've been able to handle myself better. But I really appreciated her saying that, and like in no way, shape, or form did she validate any of the insecurities I had about myself. And because you hear stories of advisors like breaking student spirits all the time, and never ever did she do that. And yeah, she's just been wonderful and great. And I think she gives great advice to students because it's not the advice you'd expect. Like from an advisor, you would expect an advisor to say, no, you need to have a set path, and you always need to know the next step of what you're doing. And if you don't have a plan, what's wrong with you? But she's very much the person that's like, look, if you need to take a couple of years to explore post-grad, like go do it. Like you don't need to have a decision right now. And society's pre-prescribed paths are just that. Like there's no reason you actually have to do this in this amount of time. And when she said that, I was like, oh my goodness.
It's kind of a relief, like taken off your shoulders. I had the same experience. Yeah.
Because even me coming in as a pre-med, like, our freshman year, I was like, biochem pre-med, straight through, gap year, what? But now, like, I have completely done a 180. And I'm like, I think I'm pretty sure that I still want to go to med school, but I am not in any hurry to get there. Like, I'm planning to do 2 years of research post-grad. Like, that's what I want to do. And if I find something interesting, I'm going to go do it. Like, I'm not stressing about it anymore. So yeah. I think that's something she's really helped me and also a lot of other students to do. It's just like freak out a little less. Because I think Notre Dame's culture is meant to kind of have you freaking out all the time. And that's not great.
Yeah, it can definitely wear you down, especially when you have those moments. You're like, Orgo, I like every single test, I was right there with you. I was like, oh my God, like what is going on? Like, how am I
I've never seen a number that low.
Yeah. I feel like it wears down everyone. Like I acknowledge that's not unique to me at all, but I want to emphasize what you're saying too about that element of pride you were talking about of having to drop a class, because I think in some way we see it as failing, because we assume that whatever task we commit to, we are going to do it because, that's always what we've done. And it's almost a self-identifier or something we
Absolutely.
yeah, we really like hold near and dear to our hearts is that we're super dedicated to whatever we put on our plate. So then to kind of have to switch our mindset and be like, oh no, like part of college is having to adjust and be quick on your feet and just be okay with all the moving parts. And to take a class, even though it seems like something so small, I've realized in thinking about it myself that it kind of symbolized way more, that I had to be like okay with acknowledging like, oh, I can't do everything at once.
Right.
um that like even if I wanted to appear perfect or that I could handle everything, that's just unrealistic of me to,
The
set
big
that
thing
for myself.
for me always was I was worried about how the professor would perceive me if I didn't do everything, like even if it's an assignment, or I still do this with like assignments and things, but I'm like, oh, what will the professor think if I like assignment wise like don't turn this in completely on time, or oh, if I don't get a great grade on this, or what will this professor think if I drop their class, or if I'm getting really low grades on their exams, like they probably think the worst of me. And
Mhm.
I've learned that like that's not the case. Like 95% of the time is they're not like taking it personally. Like they're
Yeah.
not taking your academic experience personally. Like if, because even I was talking to my professor about dropping the class, and he very much did his best to help me, so it, like, to not get to that point, but it just wasn't happening for me. And when I made my final decision, he's like, no, that's fine. And he even encouraged me. He's like, if you're going to retake it, I wouldn't retake it over the summer. I'd wait until the academic semester just for quality of instruction. And like, no, like, no hard feelings, no nothing. So I think we tend to like and anytime I've turned in an assignment, a little late or something, the professors or ask for an extension, like they're never like mad at you. So I think we tend to like overthink what
uh,
our professors think about us. Like the biggest thing I've learned is they don't really care.
yeah. Yeah, I've learned as well. It's interesting you bring up professors, and as you were speaking, I was kind of reflecting. I was like, I've definitely had those moments, but I think more for me, I was always just worried, like, or I was always a little bit competitive about grades, and I think I was more internal. So I was more like, I was
Mm.
more peer oriented, I think, than because professors, I can count so many times where I just go in and be like, I have no idea. Can you help me out? Like, it never was a or I guess less, it was a professor thing versus a peer
Yes.
thing. Like I wanted to be able to, be in class and know what was going on so that when my peers were in the class and talking about it, I could also like seem knowledgeable, which
True.
probably says a lot.
No, no, that's so true.
Yeah.
Some people are really, I always feel bad for the people that are really overly into that. Like, I remember, I think it's most prevalent in your early years of college, like freshman year especially. I
Mhm.
remember, everyone would ask, well, what specific score did you get on the exam? And the people who did really well were very eager to publicize that they got a 95.
Mhm.
And it's like,
It's funny how much we value, that like
validate, yeah.
yeah, having a number to associate with your intelligence, like
Yes. It's,
um kind of bizarre, but
yeah, no, very much is. And it's just, or it's always awkward when someone's complaining that like they got an 82 and you're sitting over there with your 65. Like, yeah, tell me more about how much that sucks.
yeah, I know the intricacies of college never bore me, right? Like,
So I was glad to find that seemed to, at least in my experience, like peter off as we got older. Like I rarely hear a senior being like, or even a junior be like, oh, I got this numerical score
yeah,
on the exam. So now whenever like grades come up, I say stuff like, oh, I got the score I was hoping for, or oh, I did better than I was hoping for. Like
yeah.
you
I
can
think,
talk about your grades in relative terms, but the people who like want to put numbers behind it, I'm like, chill.
yeah, I'm curious if you think, I think there's a degree of maturity that comes along with that, with like people just being like, oh, I've had my grades and like I've learned, I've been around the college life for longer to know that there's kind of more that comes with grades. But I think there's also, at least for me, there's a switch in what I valued. And I learned that, you know, I'm gonna I'm gonna get through the class. I'm gonna get through the exam. Like whatever I come out with, sure, my GPA, you still want it to be high enough where you're getting like a source of pride from it and that you can do what you need to do with it. But I think for me, there's like this kind of click or a moment when I was like I'm studying, I'm trying the best I can, and I'm gonna miss so many other great things of college. Like I'm way more willing to have an exam and then after not let it bother the time that I'm, eating dinner with my friends or something like that. Just because I it's always in the back of my head where I'm like, oh, you're missing time. Like that's one of my huge fears in life.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you've kind of like thought the same thing or had the same switch where you place less of a value on like maybe grades or more material things and what you've kind of transitioned to value instead.
Sure. So my answer to that's going to be sort of. Since I didn't have the greatest freshman and sophomore year
Mhm.
grade wise, and considering what I'm hoping to do in the future, I have tried to be a little bit more concerned grade wise in terms of like studying smarter, not necessarily harder.
Yes, yeah.
And luckily that's paid off, and I'm getting the upward trajectory I've hoped for. But I definitely, especially in light of the coronavirus pandemic, do have some regrets. Well, I mean, I guess it's kind of weird because, like, for me, I feel like I worked just as hard, if not harder, my freshman and sophomore years, and it didn't pay off in the way that I wanted.
Mhm.
So, in that respect, I was like, I don't regret like not studying more then because I don't even know if that was possible at that point.
Right, yeah.
But in light of the pandemic, I was like, oh, I wish you had kind of done more socially earlier
Mhm.
because you had more of that time. Whereas, like, I was kind of talking to you about this beforehand. You know, like before I was 21, I was like, oh, I'll have like my senior year, and by then I'll have like most of my academic stuff established, so it'll be fine. And now I'm in a pandemic and not able to do
Yeah.
most of that stuff. So I kind of do wish I had taken more time to do more social stuff earlier on than just be like so academically laser focused, especially since like it panned out how it panned out. So I do try nowadays to do more, and even for me it's like even if that means turning in something a day late and getting like a small deduction, I'd rather have that than like miss one of my friends is like graduating or leaving, like my friend's going away party, like I'm not about to miss that to
Yeah.
do this. So I've tried to be a little bit more like I've tried to get away from it, but it's also still very much a priority just because I'm trying to
Yeah.
pass
It's
those first 2 years.
mhm.
But
And that can be
definitely,
so frustrating too. It kind of like when we were discussing this a bit, how you were saying, you wish you had spent more time socializing or whatever just because of the pandemic. It's heartbreaking, honestly, just like to hear you even say that. And I feel the same exact way, there's such a um like I think every single person feels it of just having like a robbed sense of time, like
for sure.
socializing and all these things. And I think it's across all age levels. um
No, I totally agree, and I definitely don't want to. I'm not unique. I'm not alone in that. And I think for a lot of us, especially people who adhere more rigidly, like one of the reasons they did adhere more rigidly was like, let's get this over with so we can have, as much of a normal college experience senior year as possible. So to see that those efforts, haven't been realized on a national scale, it's hard because you feel like you're doing your part and, for this thing that you want, but it's just, not happening, and you can't go down the rabbit hole of thinking like, well, what if this had been different, because it's just what it is. And I mean, I'm at the point where it's hard for me to even fault people who do do maybe less pandemic friendly just because it's so difficult. And anyone who, like, at first I was on the train of like, oh, it's not that hard, and like, why? And like, at the beginning, sure, and I still feel like that to an extent, but like, I definitely am more empathetic and understanding to the fatigue that comes with this, and like how it seems like worth it in the long run to be like, okay, let me do this, let me go to this one thing and do this one thing, and that'll be my one thing, because you don't know when this is going to be less bad at this point.
Yeah.
It seems to only be getting worse. So then it's just hard. It's just so hard. And even though, like, I guess my big takeaway is, like, judge people a little bit less, because it's very fatiguing, especially at this point.
Yeah, I think, and thank you for being honest about that, because I do know it takes a lot of courage to even just like say that mid-pandemic, because it can, I think, sometimes and sadly like polarize people. And that's something, we were back in-person classes, and one, like, very much so, just being at Notre Dame kind of in the spotlight for a couple of different things.
Yeah.
Like in the national spotlight, I mean, with that. But I had the same kind of approach, or I've realized now, just like to give more grace, and I've been trying to find like a balance in the pandemic, because I think there's so many different factors that play into it, and it took a long time for me to kind of realize, like, we're both social people, so I think we can relate to this, and just being like, that's where I get my ultimate source of happiness, and where I feel most confident and like my most truest self is when I'm around those that I love. And I think you relate, where we have like multiple social circles, and we're like, oh, we want to see them, and it might not just be that one person that we might live with, or living alone, like being in a dorm.
Yeah,
there's
I was in a single.
Exactly.
I've been in a single, and I'm an introvert, and that, like, I don't necessarily get my energy from being so, but like, I think introverts get a wrong reputation of like, oh, they don't like being social, and I don't think that's true. I very much like being social. It's just like sometimes smaller social is better for me.
Exactly.
But,
yeah.
Like, me living in a single, and the people who lived across from me in my quad, I didn't know as well this year, because most of my senior friends moved off campus, and the ones that stayed wanted singles of their own. Can't blame them. But so I didn't really have anyone to like chat with on a daily basis, and I found that to be really difficult, because I would come home and I would just sit in my room, and before, I would at least have the dining hall. I would get dinner with a friend, or I would at least like see someone while I was there in passing. But because of the restrictions, most of the time, because it's again, we'll get more into this later, but because of my disability, it's hard for me, especially, to sit outside, especially when it starts getting colder.
Yes,
and it's not convenient for me. So I would sit and eat in my room most of the time, and that, well, even just like that image, you feel so sad eating your little takeout container alone in your room. And I was like, this is just like
the quality of life. I know. And I think about you honestly a lot, because and a couple of other friends that I have that stayed on campus, and that transition, because mostly juniors are on campus and senior year people move off. It's just one of those Notre Dame traditions, kind of always has been like that, for at least while we've been there. And I was thinking about this because I was talking to teammates who were a couple years older than us, and they were like, oh, the transition to off campus is just really hard and weird, because you're so used to having those interactions with people at dining halls and just walking around campus, whatever. So add that with a pandemic now, where it was so much more complicated, and I understand like people were doing so much to make it work, but it just isn't the same, you know? And that's why I like to say social instead of introvert versus extrovert, because I do agree. I think there is sometimes a misconception that can be there in introvert. And I've learned, you know, that's why it's very, very difficult to perhaps like not want to judge other people when you see them being less conscious of the pandemic. But I've just found myself in those moments being like, I how can I like judge? I think there's a like element of jealousy as well, because you're like, oh my God, I want to be doing that too. But
Absolutely.
then you're like fighting with yourself and there's a guiltiness to it, and you're like, oh my gosh, like I'll feel guilty if I do that, and then I'm putting other people at risk, but I want to do that. So then you feel even worse, and it's like a snowball of just emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, especially as someone, like, I'm not saying like go out and throw a rager and forgive everyone who does. Like, no, like that's not what I'm saying. But like, okay, if you see someone out to eat with their friend, like chill a little, maybe. Like,
Yeah, I know.
because, well, especially for me, like that's kind of been I don't want to say like my risk piece, but I'm like, okay, like if I go see someone like one on one, like unmasked, and I do my best to like contain myself afterward, like that's the leeway I've given myself. And if I want to do more than that, I just usually leave a mask on. But like before, I was like, I'm not gonna do anything with anybody. And it's like it's just not realistic to expect
Or sustainable too.
or
Like,
sustainable like to expect absolutely zero nothing. Like I know there are some really strong people that can manage to do that, and unfortunately, like I'm just not one of those people, and I think most of the population wouldn't be able to do that very well. So I think, while I'm not saying like I said, I'm not condoning having a rager, but I think I think we can be at least understanding of people from like a social human being standpoint. And being a neuroscience major and having learned firsthand about like not just how important we think social connections are from like a subjective standpoint, but how literally important they are in terms of our like development as human beings. Like the pandemic scenario is not what our brains are evolved to do, like to do, and to have
optimally work at.
yeah, and to have such a stark absence of social connection, like I'm just saying neurologically, it all makes sense. People breaking and going to do a thing, like that makes like neurobiologically, that makes sense.
Yes, yeah.
You know, so I'm just saying, like, from that standpoint, I can't fault people because like it's unfortunately we are being asked to do things that are very against our biological conditioning. And whenever you do that, I'm not saying it's wrong. Like we're definitely right to be imposing public health restrictions, but I'm just saying like you can't expect 100% compliance. You just can't.
Yeah, I know. And it's so difficult too with especially being a student, like feeling as though, you know, like we have 4 years at our university, and just like I still even really struggle with the idea and the notion that like there's so many memories that are just being taken, and I try my best not to dwell on that, and to
I try not to think about graduation because it just means like it's not. I mean, I feel like like it's always bittersweet no matter what the state of the world is, but I feel like in some ways it leans more toward bitter in a pandemic because we're not even able to do the things that allow us to seek the closure that allows it to be a happy occasion. Does that make sense?
Oh, for sure. Oh my gosh, I get.
Like
I
we don't even
that.
get like. I think most of the time I'm not like super in tune with this, but I think usually seniors we have an entire week of campus to ourselves before like prior to commencement to just be
student,
Should just be
like
20.
have friends having fun. Yeah.
And as we just reviewed on our updated semester calendar, we get approximately 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not even going to be with most of campus vacated yet.
Yeah.
And I doubt there are going to be any substantial activities. Like, we can't even have, I remember every year seeing seniors post up about like the 100 days dance. We can't get one of those.
Yeah.
And it's just, and I remember always kind of like looking forward to it. And I was like, oh, like that's small, but it's cute and exciting.
Mm-hmm.
And like, it's just, because a lot of things, like, I didn't go to football this year, and that was bittersweet, especially with like what a great season we had. But I consoled myself with the fact that like football is always going to be there. Like, I can buy tickets as an alum. Like, it's okay. But these other things, like, we can't be 30 rolling up into the 100 days dance. Like, hey,
we'll throw our own 100 nights dance, right? That's what it's gonna take when all this is over.
We can't do those things over, you know. So I think that's what makes me really sad. Is like most of these things we can't just do later.
Yeah. And I'm curious as well, you mentioned it before, but I wanted to circle back around just to make sure we didn't miss it, because you do have such a unique perspective being a student with disabilities, and especially within COVID. So I would love just to know more about how that's been for you, and just like if you're willing to share and be vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give the backstory first. So I was born 3 months premature, and because of that and associated complications, I ended up being diagnosed with cerebral palsy when I was about 2 months old. And for those people who don't know, cerebral palsy is the most common like mobility impairment like disorder that people can have. And there's several different types, but essentially they think what causes it is a lack of oxygen to the brain. So because that's so general, you can have a variety of impairments and differing degrees of severity. So for me, I have what's called spastic diplegia cerebral palsy, which means it primarily affects both my legs, but I have some slight dexterity issues as well. And for me, it primarily affects my balance, my gait, so I walk a little weird, and endurance. And I've used mobility aids all my life. So I started with a walker and transitioned to crutches. But coming to college, I actually had to transition to a power wheelchair just because it wouldn't be sustainable for me to physically walk all over campus to classes. I don't have the strength for that. I don't have the endurance for that. And if I did try to do that, I wouldn't be able to student.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So, basically, as an efficiency and energy conservation mechanism and safety, when you take into account the variety of weather that we get.
Crazy weather, yeah.
So now I'm in a power wheelchair. And that was also what I was transitioning into. I was transitioning essentially out of walking full time and going into this wheelchair 95% of the time. And that was very difficult because even though I got the wheelchair like the summer after high school, it's a learning curve, especially when you're not used to it. And not only the use of the wheelchair, but also like being perceived and perceiving yourself as being in a wheelchair when you're not used to it. Like, for example, my perception of height is completely off now. I'd say, oh, that person's really tall. And then like, and a person who's not in a wheelchair would be like, no, they're not. So I was learning to navigate the world in a wheelchair as well as transition to college, and it's just everything at once.
Yeah, a lot.
There's not, I mean, my family's fantastic. They're, always after resources, and the Disability Center at Notre Dame, like, they've had experience, supporting students in wheelchairs. So, like, they were as helpful as they could be, but there's nothing that will fully prepare you before you just go into it. And so there's nothing that can fully prepare you for what that transition is going to be like. And I don't know if there's anything anyone could adequately do or adequately could say to prepare you for that. Like the first time you deal with inclement weather in a wheelchair, like
It's a whole other added stress. Yeah.
You know, and things like that. So that was a big part of what I was dealing with early on. And yeah, so there was that. And the pandemic has been interesting. This goes into like problems Notre Dame has regardless of a pandemic, but in a succinct way, I mean, this is kind of harsh, but it's the succinct way I could put it. It's kind of like they admit you, and then I don't want to say they forget about you, but that's how it feels sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Because of all the things I had to ask about, like how is this going to look different with COVID, whenever disability was brought up, it was always the walkthroughs were done, the upgrades were made, all of that was done after the fact. You know, when really what they should be doing is when you have to make a plan of any sort, whether that's, you know, standard evacuation procedure, whatever, they should be consulting the proper people in the creation of that plan, not I've made a plan, is this good? So
yeah, being more proactive maybe.
Right. So for example, with the pandemic, we were made to eat in outdoor dining tents, and I don't know if you remember, but someone actually leaked photos of the dining tents, and the first thing I noticed was that I mean, it makes sense. They do this all the time, but like the tents were raised off the ground. They weren't flush with the grass.
Yeah.
I was like, well, I can't get up there. There's no ramp. There's no. So then I had brought it up to some students in this big group chat that was going around, and like they brought it to like admin, and sure enough, like after enough complaining, like they were putting ramps on the sides of the tents, and it's like they might have been planning to do that anyway, because of course those were just like preliminary pictures that were leaked. But the thing is, I can't trust them to think of those things ahead of time. Is the issue. It's like that's the thing, is like you always feel like you have to think. In my experience, you feel like you have to think of every single thing because you know they're not going to think of it first.
And if I'm not mistaken, that's part of the mission of Access-Able, right?
Yeah, so I started Access-Able in my sophomore year, and essentially that was born out of, you know, so like I mentioned, my freshman and sophomore years were difficult.
Yeah, I remember, because that's when we met as well. I remember we've had conversations about that as well.
Yeah, so our three like mission pillars, if I had to summarize them, were promoting advocacy, spreading awareness, and building community. So if I'm going to break down those three, promoting advocacy is like you are a person with a voice, you have power, and you need to use that to communicate whatever it is that you need, and that it's totally valid and allowed. Like, don't let anyone tell you that you shouldn't be speaking up for what you need, because it's absolutely necessary, especially in a place like Notre Dame, where they don't have a rich infrastructure regarding disability and accessibility, because it's a beautiful campus, but it's also a historic campus, and that has its own implications. Spreading awareness is basically because I noticed that, you know, Notre Dame does try with its diversity efforts, and whether or not they are succeeding is a completely different conversation. But in their arms of diversity, nowhere did they mention anything about disability, and I never saw it advertised, even just in simple things. Even if I exclude cultural and social diversity for a minute, they rarely even brought it up in terms of infrastructure things. And even physical accessibility. Like, it was just this past year that I saw the Welcome Weekend schedule, and they finally put a blurb: if you need alternate access or accommodations, this is who you contact. Like, they're still on that baseline step of like including disability. So that was this part. We wanted to provide that missing piece of, one, like education, because most of the student body has not been exposed, you know, to this population.
Yeah.
And Notre Dame isn't doing they're starting to take an interest, but they hadn't really been doing work to see disability as diversity or even educate on disability. And like Moreau or Building Community Notre Dame, the preliminary like diversity modules they have us do. So that was that. And then Building Community was because I didn't know how to connect with people on campus that might have been having similar experiences. Because there was no like hub or anything like that. Like they have a disability center, but of course they can't disclose, oh, so and so is just like you, because that's a breach of privacy.
Yeah.
And, unless you heard it through some grapevine, there was no way to connect with those people. So I wanted to have a place where, if you were looking for any sort of community, that it was there and this is a place you could go. And also it's just become a great resource for people to share, like, oh, I have this accommodation for this, or have you ever considered asking for this? And it's been really great. And that the pandemic has been also like a topic of discussion there. Like, are we getting everything we need? If so, how can we, or if not, how can we make that happen? Or, what sorts of things we should be thinking about.
Yeah. Well, that's so commendable. And, I'm so happy just like for yourself and for others that you took the time to realize something that needed to be added to our campus, and that you were able to, have this like unique club, but also just to find such a value in community, and also just like sharing, like taking time out of your day to, in my humble opinion, I think better the student body. It is not lost on me how proud I am just like to know you and have you as a friend. And I don't think I've ever expressed that.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to know you as well, and I appreciate all your support and doing things like I think this is incredible, honestly, because I completely support your message of we just need to start listening to people. And even like, I'm a very opinionated person. Like,
I love that about you. That's exactly why I wanted to have this conversation.
But even me, like I really do try to take the time to like to hear people. I'm willing to hear people out if they have reasons for what they have to say, even if I don't agree with them.
I agree.
As long as people have their reasons, I'm okay with it. Like, what makes me angry and frustrated is if I ask someone, why do you think this way? Why do you feel this way? And they don't have a reason. That's what makes me upset.
Yes, for sure.
So as long as people have opinions, like I don't, and reasons for why they have them, I'm totally open to listening. I might respond and say I disagree with you because, but I have been trying to do better about just facilitating communication, because I think there are a lot of things right now that are dividing society, and I'm not going to go into whether that's valid or not, because that's like a 3-hour conversation.
Right. But I keep going and going.
But I do think one of the things that, even if we vehemently disagree with people, I'm very curious why people have the opinions that they have.
Yeah, just having a genuine curiosity for it, for sure.
And I think even if I'm still in complete vehement disagreement with you after that, I can at least reflect and say, I don't agree, but I can see, given your life experience, why you might have formed that opinion.
For sure. I think that's a very mature way to see it as well. I think knowing you, of course, just as a student and a friend, like I know that you can see things like that. And I hope, that everyone finds their place to that sooner rather than later, of having a little bit more empathy and understanding, and being able to maybe pull away the personal side of it a bit and not get offended, and have those more like educated, curious debates almost, or conversations,
For sure. And I really, something that resonated with me is something a friend of mine said. I was worried about how someone would perceive something I was saying. And my friend said, Monica, I think anyone who knows your story and like things that have happened to you would not think that like what you were saying was ridiculous, or like was a ridiculous ask, or whatever it was. And I think that's really true. Like if you think you have like a stupid request of someone, or something you want done for a specific reason, it's like, just like, most of the time, if you just tell people like why it is that you feel a certain way, like it makes sense to people. So I think that's really I think it's just really valuable to try and understand where people are coming from, even if you don't agree with where that all leads.
Yeah.
I think we can at least make sense of it.
Mm-hmm. And I love to kind of understand more just about, you mentioned the transition between using mobility aids and having a power wheelchair, and just the perception of both yourself and others.
Sure. Yeah. So for myself, I'm still in a bit. I'm in an interesting place. So in terms of the disability community, like, okay, so first, actually, I'll start with outside the disability community. Wheelchairs are often seen as like negative, even I'm not subconsciously, like, or like a symbol of illness, sickness, impairment, injury, whatever you.
Yeah.
Like all negative associations, right? And what the disability community is really trying to get others to understand is that no, like wheelchairs aren't inherently a bad thing. Like they can empower us and give us a lot more freedom than we otherwise would have had. It's not necessarily bad for someone to be in a wheelchair. This could be allowing them to do so many things that they hadn't yet been able to do. And for me, is I wouldn't, like I said, I wouldn't have been able to tackle college if I didn't have a wheelchair behind me to help me do that. But then there are some things about the wheelchair that I don't quite love compared to other mobility aids. Like it's pretty cumbersome. You can't just throw it in the car.
Yeah. Chuck it in the car or go on. Yeah.
Yeah. Or, sometimes it does get stuck due to weather, and they do. What they don't tell you is when you're a college student and you're out in all kinds of weather, your power chairs are going to need repairs, and those repairs aren't cheap. And things like that. And then for me, it's somewhat actually like limiting socially, because I might need it to get to the dorm, the place, the wherever, but then I can't really take it inside, and because of the spacing, so there are things like that. And for me, what's been a big thing is I've actually seen, because I'm in the wheelchair so much and I'm not walking and I'm not standing, I have actually lost ability. I can get it back if I like really committed to like physical therapy, but unfortunately I don't have time for that as a full-time student. So I have seen myself lose ability since coming to college, and that's something I've kind of had to come to terms with, of like I've chosen my academics over like my, shall I say, raw physical abilities, and that's a choice that I've made, and that's a choice that I've had to live with. And for example, for me, I didn't realize how big of a deal like standing was in terms of like being perceived. Like, like there's something to be said for being eye level with people, and being able to look directly at them when you're conversing with them. And this is very first world problem, but even like outfits and stuff, like for me, it doesn't, like there's something to be said, in my opinion, for like walking into a room, because I've had the experience of doing that. Or like I joke with my friends now, like now whenever I buy a new outfit, I have to do the sit down test, like how does this look sitting down, because that's what I'll be doing 95% of the time. And it's just things like that. Like I don't know, I like being able to stand, I like being able to walk, like, and some people might have a problem with me saying that, but like because I've had that experience, I'll say I prefer that. And I don't know if that's me internalizing like societal things, which like we call like internalized ableism in the community. And ableism, you can think of it as like similar to like racism, sexism, but like against people with disabilities. But like, so that's been hard, even like the transition of like how I see myself.
Yeah, I think there's something to say, and I hope that no one would like discredit you for saying that you enjoy standing and walking just because like that is your experience. So I hope no one, would ever be upset at you for that. But just
You never know.
right, yeah, I know. You're right. You never do know. And I'm so appreciative that you're just like sharing all this because again, like I can't relate, and it's so helpful for me just to understand your own perspective and standing on it. And I'm curious with that choice, with you're saying like between academics and the physicality of moving around and kind of losing some of that mobility. Do you think, has there ever been a moment where you've perhaps like questioned that decision or any like regretted it at all?
It's hard. I would say I regret not incorporating more intermittent stuff because it definitely doesn't have to be as stringent as I make it. But like for example, I have an incredible friend who goes to PT for several hours, like multiple times a week, and like works out externally to that multiple hours a day,
Mhm.
multiple days per week. And I don't, and I know she has like sacrificed academically for that. So for me, I don't regret, I commend her for going as hard as she does, but I don't think that's realistic for myself. So I think I could have done a better job about, doing smaller, more intermittent stuff. But I'd say overall, I don't regret it because my dad had this really great quote, like, your brain will take you farther than your legs ever could.
Oh, that's a great quote. Yeah.
And I mean, maybe I internalize that too much, but in some regards, but I've always agreed with that. And I've figured like once I get to where I need to be, I can make amends from there. So
Yeah.
one of my goals for the future is to try to incorporate stuff more intermittently into like my daily life because like my physical therapist always said like the goal isn't to be in structured physical therapy till the end of time. The goal is for physical therapy to get you to a point, and then we give you things to do and you just incorporate like how able-bodied people just go to the gym, like similar things, like you just need to do it in
Mhm.
your everyday life. Like you don't go to physical therapy till the day you die. Like it's not how it works.
Yeah. Yeah, right. You're not meant to live in
Right,
peace.
because
Yeah.
most people have jobs and things like that where you can't stop to go to therapy at 2 p.m. Like like that doesn't work. So that's my goal for the future, is to try to incorporate stuff more.
Uh-huh.
But I'd say overall I haven't regretted it. Like it is disappointing at times when I'm like, oh, I used to be able to do that, and I guess I can't do that anymore.
Uh-huh.
That's too bad. But um at least for me in my condition, I know that like if I committed to working at it, I could get to a point again. So
Mhm.
um that's good. I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I thank you for being honest because I know it, isn't sometimes easy, especially with the ways that people can perceive,
Yeah.
being in a wheelchair. And you mentioned ableism, and because I know, just because I know you, and you always like, I admire that you take the chance to educate people and don't get perhaps offended or upset. With others, if there was, something you'd like to share with people, just like educate, I guess, what would it be?
Sure. I think hmm, this is a tough one. I
I know
think
I'm hitting the hard questions now.
well, not because like there's a lot of things that apply in various different contexts, but I think overall I'd say in the way that people have typically viewed disability, viewed it's portrayed in a way that is the most important, not important, but
Like defining character.
yeah, it's like a person's defining characteristic, and so much so that like a lot of this is, I mean, it's one of my pet peeves. Like someone will come up to me, and before they even ask me like what my name is, they'll ask me about what my deal is being in the wheelchair.
Uh-huh.
And I think for me, and some people take me saying that as like, you're not open to educating people, you're not open to questions. No, I'm very open to educating people, and I'm very open to questions. But I think I don't like being watered down into
Mm-hmm.
my disability and my disability alone. And I think that's something that society tends to do, or they expect, all people with disabilities to have a similar attitude because of how they've seen it portrayed in the media or something like that. And I just think that people should take the time to get to know the individual as you would any other person in
Right.
your life. And that education piece will, I'd say 9 times out of 10, come out. Like a lot of times what I do with friends is like, hey, we've gotten to know each other for a while now and it's been great. I just wanted to open the floor like, hey, if you have any questions,
Mm-hmm.
I'm here to answer them. Like, go forth and ask.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
I just think that's the thing. It's like people sometimes like don't know how to act, but it's like, just proceed how you normally would.
Yeah,
And
you almost, I bet, feel like saying like just act normal. Like you don't have to, like it shouldn't be an act,
just
like
act natural.
yeah, act natural. Yeah, for sure.
But honestly, like that's a thing, and I don't want people to take that, like, because some people, like I said, have taken that in a way, like, oh, we can't ask Monica any questions about herself.
Yeah.
No,
It's
that,
part of
that
your story,
yeah,
like
like that's not true at all. It's just that I want people. Well, I should say I'm very much more open to telling people my story if they've taken the time to acknowledge me as an individual. Like
yes.
like you, I'll sit here and I'll tell my story all day. But the random guy who cut across the grass in front of St. Liam's to be like, what happened to you?
Yeah. Oh God.
Story that doesn't really lean to me launching into my whole life story.
Yeah, especially, like it's anything, it's equivalent to like anything you hold like near and dear to your heart, or like any intimacy, like it's something about you. Like it isn't just so casual that you're like, oh, like here's my like life story.
And some people are,
Mhm.
some people will entertain the rando on the street, but, and I'm not saying that's they're wrong for that. I think it's like to each their own. But to me, it feels, I don't want to say cheap, but like the best analogy I've heard recently is someone in the disability community saying, I'm not a self-narrating zoo exhibit.
Ah,
And I was like,
good
that is the
analogy.
perfect description. Because
Yeah.
like that's how it feels sometimes. It's like a drive-by. Oh, what's up with you? Oh, I have da da da. Oh, okay, move on. Like
Yeah. Kind of
it's
like impersonable, like impersonal, I
right.
guess.
They have no interest in you as a individual human being sitting in front of them. They just want to know like their factoid.
Yeah.
Get on with their day. And I think that like cheapens the interaction. And I don't know. Some people have no problem with this at all, but
Well, this is your opinion. That's what's so great about it is
but I just think it's, I don't know.
hmm
I just think it's not, it cheapens the individual in front of you to just like a fact of some sort that you want to know. And I don't think that's an appropriate way to engage with a human being.
Yes. No, I completely agree. I think you are so valid in expressing that and sharing that, and I hope people will kind of take that to heart, because I think that's such a great thing, is just like to approach any person like a human, like you would in any situation. And I think it's, sometimes sad that it we can like distort things, or I want to think, just being an optimist, that people, it's out of not wanting to offend someone.
For sure.
And I think that can get lost in a message or whatever, warped up in time. And
Yeah,
the
remember
environment
that
we're
like
in.
I'd say 99% of people don't mean anything negative at all by their interaction. And I am completely aware and understanding of that. And I'm not trying to villainize, anyone who may have done that. Like I understand why like I understand why it's a curiosity. That's not lost on me. But I think there's room for more meaningful conversation that can be had. And
Yes, yeah.
yeah, and I just think that, like, especially because disability is so little engaged with in terms of the diversity, like, movements that we've had throughout history, I think that taking the time to listen to people in this group more, and I'm certainly not a spokesperson for everyone. There's a multitude of different disabilities out there, and I can only speak to my experience. But I think that in general, society needs to engage more with people with disabilities. And I think what I'm going to call drive-by interactions don't, it doesn't add anything.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, that's completely understandable. And even just thinking about it, like, as a friend, I'm like, there's that level of like protectiveness where I'm like, I hope you never had like that 1% or whatever of people who just like for some reason or another aren't based in like a good faith, effort. And I know that it has, unfortunately, like it is a reality,
Yeah, and I'm like, the joke I made about, like, the guy cutting across the lawn in St. Liam's to ask me, like, that's real, that happened. And I'm sure that guy, like, meant well, but like, but to me it was just like, I mean, I was also like I was like out of it, and
yeah, coming out of St. Liam's is our like university.
It was very out of the blue of my day, so like that played a role in my like reaction / confusion. But like that kind of thing, it just throws you off.
Mm-hmm.
I would say more so than like, it doesn't offend me. It's just very, I mean, I guess depending on how you ask, it could be a little offensive. But most of the time, it throws me off because don't.
Yes, yeah.
Do that. So it just kind of, when someone does, you're actually like,
yeah. And going
that hasn't happened to me since I was a child, and kids are kids, but
yeah. And going back to like, I'm sure it also can kind of lean into how you perceive yourself, and there might be like that element of maybe like self-doubt where you're like, is that like how like the only thing strangers are seeing?
Absolutely. And if you want to get all like psychological about it,
oh please do. We're both neuro majors. We do this on regular.
Actually, so in my I'm gonna say tenure at Notre Dame, there have been 4 people, including myself, with wheelchairs.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point we were all on campus at one time. I kid you not, I have been mistaken for every single one of them. No. And we don't look alike whatsoever, beyond and our chairs don't even look alike.
Mm-hmm.
And I can laugh at it because it's funny, but in some ways you can't help but think, like, is that really all people are perceiving?
Yeah.
When they perceive me, not consciously, but I'm thinking it from like a psychological standpoint. Is it like brain heuristic, like, oh, wheelchair,
like association?
Yeah, like, I don't, there's probably some study on it somewhere, but it's just like, I sat back and I looked at like these collective interactions when I realized, like, oh, I've been mistaken for not just one of them, but each of them, and we're all incredibly different. It in some ways, like, even though it's probably subconscious on their part, confirms like
fear almost,
how dominating of a visible disability can be in like people's perception of you. And it's just kind of like, it's interesting. I think like, when people have their first impression of me, is it the same type of first impression that like most people get, I guess, is like the question in my brain. I don't know, but that was something that really kind of took me aback. Was like, are they seeing, like, I'm like, does this mean they're not seeing my face? Does this mean like what does that mean? And yeah, so it's something I've thought about a lot, and I don't know if there's anything that can be done about it, because it's still because seeing someone in a wheelchair or with any sort of physical difference is still so jarring in our brains that like it's gonna stick out and it's gonna be remembered. And speaking of things that are really hard, when you have a physical disability of any kind, you don't get to be inconspicuous anymore. There's no, oh no, I'm late to class and I'm just gonna slide into the back. No, you're making a big deal out of it. Everybody knows you're late. Hello, professor. Good morning. I'm very late. Like you have to like. There's no. Like I've gone to the bookstore multiple days in a row, and I feel weird about it each time because like they know.
Yeah.
And like you just don't get to be inconspicuous anymore, and sometimes that's really hard. Or if you're in a difficult situation, you might not be able to just walk away like some other people, just I should say exit as easily as other people can. And so you have to, for better or for worse, either learn or tolerate like situations of extreme discomfort because
you don't have that like
because all eyes are on you because it's not, you can't just slide in, you can't just make yourself nondescript so you can
blend in.
And like people know, and it's just the way it is. And like my dad was joking, he's like, oh, I went to the store and a mask, a baseball hat, and no one, like I passed people I knew and no one said anything. I'm like, that is the level of anonymity I desire to be able to have. And with that, it's just unfortunately because so few people use these devices or walk differently or what have you. They know it's you. Too bad, so sad.
Yeah, for sure. And it's so enlightening just to hear you even say that too, because there, of course, like you have moments where you're like, oh my gosh, I just want to like blend in. And of course, for that whatever moment, it's like you can't, no matter what you do, you were like spotlight is on you, like professors calling on you, whatever, like you're a mess, out of breath, like whatever it is, like so frazzled, and you're just like, please, anything, like I just, my one thing, like, and it's always what we can't have that we want the most. And it's such a, of course, a deeper level than that, just like being frazzled or whatever. But thank you for sharing, because I know that takes like a lot of vulnerability.
Yeah, and it's surprising, like I've become increasingly more comfortable with it over the years because I've kind of realized, like, I mean, we're not getting into it on this podcast, but like, I've shared some things to people that like are even more traumatic, like have been even more so, like I would classify it as like traumatic that have happened to me, and it's just I'm not like, sometimes it's hard to talk about, but I view it as if my like trauma or negative experiences can help people either learn how to better interact with people or watch out for things when people interact with others, or just be cognizant that these sort of things happen, that's better. Because unfortunately, a lot of people with disabilities who experience things may not be able to communicate as well what had happened to them. And I'm not a voice for those people. That's not what I'm saying. But I think I'm very grateful for the opportunity to make people aware of the things that I've experienced, and do so in a way that, like according to one friend, like doesn't, like my friend is like, you never make people uncomfortable and you never like burden them.
I'll stand by that. I agree with that.
Like the negative things that have happened to you. And I guess that must just happen because I'm not trying. I'm not thinking about,
that's how to motive. Yeah.
I'm not consciously telling my story in a specific way to make it so it's like that. So anytime I can teach people or make people more aware that things are going on, like I'll take that opportunity because I think it's important.
Yeah, I think so too. And that's what I'm trying, like one of my goals with just this podcast and whatnot is to try and learn like more from, of course for myself, but also just for other people who I think are out there and are genuinely curious. And I know you're the same way, like always just wanting to know more about people and understanding them and
Absolutely.
educating them. So thank you again. I know we've been chatting for a while and I
Yeah,
always love
I
it.
can talk forever. I'm like, oh no, she's gonna regret having me on here.
Oh, never. This is Monica. Why do you think that yearbook interview really went well? Like we are just two people who love to just chat. And it's always so much fun too. So I was like, oh, well, let it come on. But in all seriousness, thank you so much, Monica. I know, just like from being your friend, and I mentioned it before, but I don't think I've ever properly told you, but I'm just so happy that, our stars aligned and we were able to meet. And
Yes, me
um,
too. I'm so grateful for that. And so shout out to GA, I guess,
yeah.
for facilitating our friendship.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it's always the classes, like some of my closest friends. You feel like went through it together, went through the ringer. So, um, thank you again, Monica.
Yeah,
You were amazing and for
of course.
sharing everything with us.